So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My name is Dr. Shubda Chaudhary, and today we are going to talk about what is the future of Israel-Hamas ceasefire. And before we start, I would request all of you who are watching to like and subscribe to our video. Today, we are having a very esteemed guest, and we are very empowered to have him, Professor James M. Dorsey. We all know about him, but here is a very brief introduction from my part. Professor Dorsey is an award-winning journalist and scholar. He's an adjunct senior fellow at Nanyang Technological University, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. He's also the author of syndicated column and blog, The Turbulent World of Middle East. If you don't follow it, I would request you to do religiously follow it. So with this, sir, thank you so much for the privilege of your time, and the floor is all yours now.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Shubda, and thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us. I look forward to this and to the discussion that we'll have. There was still a Gaza ceasefire in place when Shubda and I first discussed this webinar. We can discuss details of the ceasefire's breakdown, Israel's revival of hostilities, and efforts to get the guns to again fall silent in the question and answer session. What I would like to offer in my introductory remarks is food for thought on some of the broader themes that shape and have shaped the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over the past century plus as such, and particularly in the last year and a half. Most immediately, I would argue that Israelis and Palestinians have moved in diametrically opposed and mutually exclusive cycles for much of the past 6 decades. A significant segment of Israeli society favored, until the late 1970s, a compromise solution to the conflict with the Palestinians. Even if the center-left Labour Party initiated with broad public support Israeli settlement activity in Palestinian lands conquered during the 1967 Middle East War. Public support for a compromise began to erode with the 1977 election of Likud leader Menachem Begin, the Israeli right's first electoral victory since the state's founding. By the 1990s, Israel had moved to the right with the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and the rise of Benjamin Netanyahu. The mood in the country was becoming more hardline and uncompromising, fueled by a series of lethal suicide attacks in the 1990s that dampened optimism in the wake of the 1993 Oslo Accords. In addition, Netanyahu increasingly sought to hollow out the internationally recognized Palestine Authority by abandoning the concept of a two-state solution, undermining the authority's credibility, and turning it into a security adjunct of the Israeli state. If Israel was becoming more hardline, Palestinians were moderating their positions. The Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, went through a torturous process that started with Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine leader Nayef Hawatmeh in 1974, addressing Israelis directly as Israelis in a major Israeli newspaper. The process culminated in 1988 with Yasser Arafat's recognition of Israel's right to exist and disavowal of the armed struggle. Hamas embarked on a similar, equally torturous process in 2017. Like the PLO, Hamas marred its endeavor with violence. In the PLO's case, it was the Democratic Front's 1974 attack on a girls' school in the Israeli town of Ma'alot. In Hamas's case, it was the group's brutal October 7, 2023 attack that provoked a devastating war by an unhinged Israel at an unwarranted cost to Palestinians' lives and society and Gazan infrastructure. As a result, Hamas's popularity has nosedived in Gaza, even if opinion surveys suggest that the group is doing better in the West Bank. Even so, it's too early to draw conclusions from this week's anti-Hamas protests in the northern Gazan town of Beit Lahia. Being opposed to Hamas does not necessarily translate into support for Israel, the West Bank-based internationally recognized Palestine Authority, or abandonment of the armed struggle. To be sure, the attack and Israel's response have moved the Palestinian issue closer to the top of the international agenda, but at a horrendous price for Gaza and the Palestinians. If anything, the attack spotlighted the fact that for Hamas, despite its moves towards endorsement of a two-state solution, and for Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains a zero-sum game. Neither recognizes the existence of innocent civilians on the other side of the divide. The refusal to recognize the existence of innocent civilians is but one indication that Hamas and Netanyahu's Israel are mirror images of each other. The notion of a zero-sum game weaves through all aspects of the conflict. This is evident in the prioritization of Israeli security and the dismissal of the notion of Palestinian security for the security of the Palestinians, rather than exclusively for the security of Israelis. That same principle of inequity, coupled with a land grab and dictate, applies to Israel's recent decimation of the Syrian military following the toppling of President Bashar al-Assad by rebels with discarded jihadist antecedents. Israel's approach to negotiations is equally problematic. Israel demands, as it did with the PLO, that Palestinians play their trump cards, recognition of Israel as a Jewish state and abandonment of the armed struggle, before entering a negotiation, rather than as part of a negotiation. Hamas's refusal to do so is one reason why Gaza has witnessed a cycle of escalating wars since 2008, culminating in Israel's response to the October 7 attack. It also is part of why Hamas rejects demands that it disarm. In demanding recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, rather than simply as a state, Israel is demanding acceptance of its national narrative, rather than acknowledging that Israelis and Palestinians are likely to have rival narratives that challenge one another, but can exist next to each other. Just how far Israel has moved away from accepting the notion of rival narratives is evident in a comparison of Netanyahu and the late Israeli Defense Minister Ezer Weizmann, who was a member of the Prime Minister's Likud party during Menachem Begin's reign. Standing in front of a Likud map that showed Israel encompassing the West Bank and Jordan in the late 1970s, after Egyptian President Anwar Sadat's groundbreaking 1977 visit to Jerusalem, Weizmann was asked what the difference was between the Likud's vision and PLO leader Yasser Arafat's notion of a secular democratic state from the river to the sea. We can dream, so can they, Weizmann replied. With this month's resumption of hostilities in Gaza, Israel has applied its negotiating strategy to the battlefield. The piecemeal release of hostages serves Netanyahu's goal of prolonging the war. It was Israel, rather than Hamas, that rejected a release of all hostages in one go in exchange for an end to the war and an Israeli withdrawal from the Strip. The release of the hostages does not only reduce public pressure on Netanyahu to prioritize their return to Israel. Hamas's leverage in the ceasefire negotiations diminishes with every hostage who is exchanged for Palestinians incarcerated in Israel, which is why Israel refuses to engage in the second phase of ceasefire negotiations, as long as Hamas holds on to a substantial number of captives. Today's battle for Gaza is a battle for Palestine. It's a battle in a world where the rule of law has been all but abandoned. It's a world with a critical mass of civilizationalist leaders who define their country's borders in civilizational and security terms, rather than as defined by international law. It's a world in which war crimes are acceptable and ethnic cleansing is part of polite table conversation. It's a world in which weaponizing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia aids and abets the broader curtailing of freedom of expression and the rolling back of democracy, as we are witnessing in, among others, the United States, Israel, and Turkey. An international conference on combating anti-Semitism that opened in Jerusalem yesterday put Mr. Netanyahu's embrace of the far right at the expense of Israel's relations with Jewish communities across the globe and countries, particularly in Europe, that still support it. The conference was the first time far-right groups with a history of anti-Semitism and neo-Nazism were invited to an Israeli government event. The presence of, among others, France's National Rally, Spain's Vox, the Sweden Democrats, and others prompted Israeli President Isaac Herzog, American and European Jewish leaders and intellectuals, and senior French and German officials to cancel their participation in the conference. Finally, it's a world in which a two-state solution seems more unachievable than ever. Not because of Israeli settlement policy, at least not yet, but because of the party's zero-sum approach, Netanyahu's it's us or them policy, and the Palestinian inability to close ranks and formulate a coherent strategy. So far, the facts on the ground would still allow for a two-state solution, facilitated by minor land swaps that would keep the bulk of the 750,000 Israeli settlers under Israeli rather than Palestinian jurisdiction. However, that could change rapidly with the Israeli assault on West Bank refugee camps, the displacement of tens of thousands of West Bank Palestinians, the stepped-up creation of new settlements, and increasing settler vigilantism. It's ironic against this backdrop of gloom and doom that of all people, U.S. President Donald Trump may be Palestinians and Israelis' main ray of hope, despite his encouragement of the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. In their wildest dreams, Netanyahu and his ultra-nationalist coalition partners could not have imagined a better scenario. In addition, Steve Witkoff, the president's Middle East envoy, has made clear that the consecration of Palestinian rights in an independent state is not part of the Trump administration's thinking. Even so, Israel's problem is that Trump likes to break eggs, right, left, and center. As he propagated his Gaza resettlement scheme, Trump allowed hostage negotiator Adam Berler to break another taboo by becoming the first ever U.S. official to meet with Hamas face-to-face. Witkoff subsequently added insult to injury by suggesting, in contradiction to Israeli policy, that Hamas could remain politically active in Gaza if it disarmed, and agreed not to be part of the Strip's post-war administration. Similarly, Witkoff heaped praise on Qatar's role as a ceasefire mediator at a time when Netanyahu sought to sully the Gulf state's reputation by asserting that it was in bed with Hamas. The prime minister's campaign was also designed to prevent Netanyahu from being held accountable for his years-long soliciting of Qatari funding for Hamas to keep the Palestinian polity divided between the Gaza-based group and the Palestine Authority. To be sure, no love is lost between the Trump administration and Hamas. But with at least $2 trillion on the table in potential Saudi and Emirati investment in the United States, Trump is likely to eventually be more attentive to Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's insistence that the kingdom will only establish diplomatic relations with Israel once Israel commits to a credible and irreversible path towards the creation of a Palestinian state, albeit one in which Hamas is not a player, or at least not a major player. If Palestine is one major regional fault line, Iran is another, albeit one that has shifted, at least for some of the players. Trump and Netanyahu continue to believe that the threat and willingness to use military force are the most effective ways of beating adversaries into submission, even if they differ on whether there is still an opportunity for a negotiated solution of outstanding issues with Iran. Israel's decimation of Hamas and Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed Lebanese Shiite militia and political movement, and the U.S. targeting of the Houthis in Yemen serve as litmus tests. In all three cases, Israel and/or the United States have successfully diminished military capabilities, but failed to break their political will, let alone bomb them into submission and/or oblivion. In doing so, Israel and the United States have hollowed out the Iranian-backed axis of resistance that included Syria's al-Assad, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias that are under increasing pressure to disband or integrate into the Iraqi military. Even so, there is no indication that Iran is about to bow to Trump's maximalist pressure, despite the fact that the Iranians would like a return to the negotiating table. I'll leave it at this and look forward to our discussion.
My first question to you is, and scholars can start texting the questions, there is a strong political control over the judiciary within Israel now. The members of the hostage families are being ill-treated. The protests are going on for the release of the hostages, the 59 hostages who are still in captivity. At the same time, the economic condition of Israel is worse off, especially the tourism sector. The Haredi Jews or the ultra-Orthodox Jews also do not want to be conscripted. So Netanyahu, who technically should face the election next year, I guess in October 2026, is going through a difficult time in his governance. How do you think this delay of the ceasefire or the abruption or the elimination of ceasefire is going to impact the Israeli society from within?
I think one thing to keep in mind is that prior to the October 7 attack by Hamas and the Gaza war, you were seeing months of massive protest demonstrations against what was called a judicial coup. In other words, judicial reforms that were perceived to be undemocratic. That's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is this is not unique. We've seen this in India. We've seen this in Hungary. We're seeing this at the moment in the United States. We're seeing it in Turkey, where you have mass demonstrations at the moment. So, this is part of what is in my mind, dangerous, but nonetheless global trend. And Netanyahu is using the war and people's preoccupation with other things to try and push these things through. Also keep in mind that the issue of the conscription of the Haredim is one that is years long old. And one in which, by the way, the Haredim are partially divided. One reason, not the only reason, but one reason why the Israeli army or the Israeli military does not live up to the standards it claims that it has anymore is because of religious influence, because of the influx of ultra-nationalist and ultra-religious figures, both at the rank and file level, but also within the officers' corps, all the way up to brigade commanders. And finally, the last thing I'll say on this is Netanyahu is a cat with 9 lives. He's a political survivor. You look at this and you think the rope is getting shorter and shorter. His options are becoming smaller, fewer and fewer. He's a survivor. And I think one writes him off at one's peril.
Yeah. And as you talked about Turkey, sir, what exactly in your scrutiny is actually happening in Turkey? And what impact would it have in the wider region, say Syria, Lebanon, and then eventually Israel?
Well, I mean, Erdogan has been now in power for about 2 decades. Many of the younger generation in Turkey, and Turkey is a young country, don't know anybody but Erdogan as their ruler. Uh, Erdogan is an autocrat or an authoritarian for sure. And he's been rolling back democratic freedoms, certainly since 2016, after the failed military coup. He's now in a situation where constitutionally he cannot serve a third term. So, in other words, his career as Turkey's leader would end after the 2028 um, elections. He's got two choices. He either can muster a 2/3 majority in the parliament that would allow him to make a constitutional change, that again then in turn would allow him to run for a third term, which is part of the reason why he has encouraged a ceasefire with the Kurds and has allowed the Kurdish Workers' Party leader, PKK leader, Abdullah Öcalan, to speak out. Or he does a snap election. And as long as that election takes place before 2028, and if he would get elected again, that would allow him to serve beyond 2028. For that, he needs to remove his foremost rival, who potentially could win an election against him. So that's what you're seeing. And what you're seeing in the streets is much like in 2013 with the Gezi Park protests, a massive protest that's has sustained itself for more than a week, despite mass arrests in favor of democratic freedoms and against the manipulation of the political system.
Yeah. And coming back to Israel, sir, do you think that Trump administration will, in the long run, because of their cognitive dissonance, support Israel if there is an internal civil society chaos from within?
I have no doubt that as a matter of principle, they'll support Israel. But I think, we've got to define what is support Israel. Trump needs to balance the United States' relationships in the Middle East. So on the one hand, you have a government that doesn't want a resolution to the Palestinian issue. And on the other hand, you have significant U.S. partners which can contribute to the U.S. economy in very significant ways, who need to have some form of Palestinian resolution, whether that's a full-fledged state or something less than that, something that in any case they can project as a standing up for Palestinian rights and a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem. And that is going to require pressure on Israel. Is that what Trump is going to do? I would put my money on yes. He's ultimately transactional. Money talks in his case. Money talks in most cases, but certainly in this case. The relationship between Netanyahu and Trump has not always been that close. Trump fundamentally does not like Netanyahu. And for that matter, Netanyahu may not be in power after a next election. So, there are a lot of variables here.
A lot of variables. And why do you, who exactly, for the audience, who exactly is Steve Witkoff, and why is he so important to Trump? to beat Israel-Palestine peace or Russia-Ukraine peace. Who is Steve Witkoff? What kind of diplomatic charisma, though he's a real estate person, but diplomatic charisma he has apart from his ethnicity?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that the ethnicity is what gives him his charisma.
Yeah.
First of all, he's clearly an old friend of Trump, and they're very close. And there's a lot of confidence that Trump has in Witkoff. And Witkoff is more than willing to do Trump's bidding when it comes to both the Middle East and Ukraine and Russia. Who is Steve Witkoff beyond that? That's a good question. There's lots of speculation that go. I mean, to be clear, I have not double checked any of this. I've seen the speculation. I've seen the reporting on it. Some of it is by credible journalists, which relate to his supposed relationships with elements of the Russian mafia. But again, I'm not in a position to verify those claims, or in any way to suggest that that's what this is about.
He has not claimed himself to be a Zionist as such.
Well, look, quite frankly, I don't know that is, determining whether one's a Zionist or not. That's what most people want to do. But there are Zionism, much like whatever other movement, is an umbrella movement, and it runs from the left to the right.
Yeah.
So I'm not willing to take that as the defining criteria.
Yeah.
I think the defining criteria to me is much more what is your attitude both towards Israeli rights, because let's keep one thing in mind here. Whatever one thinks of the process in which Israel was established, it exists today.
Yeah.
And there is an Israeli people. And you can't, whether you like it or not, it's not something you can turn back.
Yeah.
And there is the Palestinian people, let me be very clear, with national rights. And so for me, the criteria of judgment is not a label, whether you're a Zionist or not. It's whether or not you are equitable in the balancing of rights on both sides of the divide.
Yeah. No, the reason I asked the question was because Joe Biden, for example, self-declared himself. And this kind of terminology and also anti-Semitism has become this weaponization of words, which is, in the longer period of time, more dangerous to the Jews themselves.
Well, no, but this goes actually in the two issues here. One issue is the issue of defining, non-Jews, if you wish, defining themselves as Zionists. Christian Zionism, Christian nationalism, is at the cradle of Zionism itself. Christian Zionists played a very important role. And if you go back to one of Israel's great successes, is that I don't know that any other national movement that was so successful in lobbying, particularly in the United States and in Britain, for more than a century. And part of their success was that they had the support of the Christian Zionist movement, or the Christian nationalist movement. And many of those Christian nationalists were in power. They included Lord Balfour in Britain.
Yeah, he himself was a closet anti-Semite, though.
Yeah, absolutely. But look, from my perspective, uh, Christian Zionism, Christian, whatever, is anti-Semitic by definition because of its religious definitions in terms of what happens on the Day of Judgment.
Now, could
And
you
the
explain this
notion,
more?
basically, the basis for Christian nationalist support of Israel is the notion that on the Day of Judgment, the Jews will have to convert to Christianity or go to hell. That, as far as I'm concerned, is an anti-Semitic notion by definition.
Yeah.
Now, there's a separate issue, which I referred to in my remarks, which has to do with the curtailing of democracy and of freedom of expression as a result of a definition in which criticism of the state is defined as anti-Semitism. I mean, on those grounds, you could not criticize a sub-Saharan African state because that would be racism against blacks.
Yeah.
So, and that's taken, I think, countries, you see that now with the Trump administration and the crackdown on freedom of expression in the United States, particularly pro-Palestinian freedom of expression. That's taken democracies and European countries on a very slippery slope.
Yeah, and turning to Middle East specifically, one thing which I personally don't understand, and I come from a point of ignorance, is the sudden implantation or embedding of Jalani or Ahmad al-Sharra in Syria. He gets the name Jolani or Golani because of his ties with Golan Heights, though I think he was born in Saudi Arabia. He has been very silent on Israel's incursion into Syria, and Israel anyway does not have fixed borders. So, how do you see it playing out in the longer period of time?
Well, I don't know that he's been silent. He's been very clear that he wants an Israeli withdrawal out of the United Nations buffer zone. So you have beyond the Golan Heights themselves that were occupied by Israel in the 1967 war. They were subsequently annexed under Israeli law, and that annexation was recognized by Trump in his first term in office. Since then, or since the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime, the Israeli forces have moved beyond the Golan Heights, taking over Mount Hermon, as well as that UN buffer zone that was created in 1974 after the 1973 Middle East War. And of course, you've had, including today, Israeli attacks on basically decimating the Syrian military. And you've had the Israelis telling the Syrians that no Syrian military forces would be allowed to move or operate south of Damascus as part of Israeli security. Sharra has spoken out against that, but he also realizes, I think, that he's walking a tightrope. He's needs to get sanctions lifted, and that really means getting U.S. sanctions lifted. He has a very fragile country. We've seen the problems that there have been with in the Latakia region on the Mediterranean coast. There's still debate going on in Iran on whether or not to support the Alawites. The U.S. has been somewhat helpful to him by nudging Masluma Abadi, the head of the predominantly pro-Kurdish or Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces, to come to some sort of arrangement with al-Sharra and with the government in Damascus regarding their existence as a military force regarding the issues of autonomy and self-government or integration into a unitary Syria. So he's got a lot of things on his plate, and he understands that if he overplays his hand on the Israeli issue, that potentially could boomerang.
And what about the recent visit of the Syrian Druze to Golan Heights, though the Druze are also very much present in the IDF? And Netanyahu has stated that because he would protect the Druze and he needs to, that is the reason for invading further into Syria against HTS. So the Druze card.
That's not quite how Netanyahu formulated it. What Netanyahu said was that he would not allow Syrian forces to move south of Damascus, and that he would stand up for Druze rights in the region, which are parallel but different things. The Druze community is a community that's spread over several countries. There is an Israeli Druze community, with other words, a community of Druze with Israeli citizenship, who are, unlike other Arabs, are drafted into the Israeli military and have served historically as trackers, very capable trackers. You then have a Druze community that has lived under Israeli occupation since 1967 on the Golan Heights. And you have the Druze community in Syria, which, if you wish, is on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. What the Israelis have been trying to do is basically that they're trying to garner support among Syrian Druze. There's been a fair amount of hostility towards the Israeli occupation, and they're trying to garner support, one, by for the first time allowing Syrian Druze under Israeli occupation on the Golan Heights to interact with Syrian Druze under Israeli occupation further into Syria, in lands that they've occupied in the last 6 months. And they're working out pathways to offer Syrian Druze in Syria that have come under Israeli control since the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime to work in Israel or in the Israeli occupied Golan Heights, so that there is an economic lifeline.
Yep. And my next question, sir, is that for the past 2 days, I don't know why, but social media, with the kind of hyper reality that it has, there's a lot of assumption or prediction that US, just like it's attacking the Houthis, it's ready now, or Israel is now ready to attack Iran. And we have heard it for a very long time. But contextually speaking, is any kind of attack on Iran feasible?
Of course, it's feasible. Whether it's effective is a different story. Is it and what the fallout of that would be is a different story. But of course, it's feasible.
And
what I think what you have is the Israelis would like to strike now. They are not interested in a negotiated resolution. They want to see a military strike, whether they carry it out with Trump's green lighting, or whether the United States carries it out, or whether it's a joint attack. That's what they want to see. Trump does not want to see an attack. That is not to say that he would not attack, but his preference is a negotiated solution. And for all practical matters, the Iranians want a negotiated resolution. But on the one hand, there's a difference over what it needs to be what is it that needs to be resolved. So, as far as the Iranians are concerned, it's the nuclear issue that needs to be resolved. And they keep in mind that from their point of view, they had an agreement, they complied with the agreement, and Trump walked away from it unilaterally. What the Americans want, and that's not just Trump, that's what Biden wanted too, is an agreement that is not just about nuclear, but is about also about Iranian support for non-state actors in various countries in the Middle East, and about Iran's ballistic missiles program. Two issues that the Iranians do not want to discuss. First of all, the issue of the non-state actors, they've been severely weakened already. The axis of resistance has been hollowed out. Syria is no longer there. Hezbollah has been severely weakened. Hamas has been severely weakened. The Iraqi groups ultimately will be weakened. We'll see what happens with the Houthis, but in theory, they could also be substantially weakened. So this is an Iran that needs to rethink its defense strategy. And its defense strategy was partly a forward defense strategy, which relied on the non-state actors, and it was its ballistic missile program. So if it loses its axis of resistance, if it's willing to negotiate its nuclear program and controls and oversight of that program, what's left for in terms of its defense strategy is ballistic missiles. And clearly that's not something they're going to negotiate. Now, from Trump's perspective, he's striking the wrong chord in his attempt to get a negotiation, because he's using bullying language. He's using threats, what happens if not. And that would create the impression, if the Iranians were to engage with that, of the Iranians basically succumbing. That's not something that's going to happen. So for Trump to really be successful, he's going to have to change his tone. Not necessarily change his policy, but certainly change his tone. And second of all, what Trump is doing in trumpeting, if you wish, what it is that he expects, he's basically extending his maximalist pressure or maximalist approach to the negotiating table. Iran has to give up its nuclear program, period. It has to give up its ballistic missiles program, period. It needs to stop all funding and support of non-state actors. So, with other words, it's a little bit the Israeli negotiating tactic. This is what you need to do. You need to accept this, and then we can talk.
My two last questions is first, would the disclosure of JFK files or Epstein files, whatever the level of disclosure is or understanding of it is, would it create any kind of impact on? No.
I don't think so. I mean, it may or may not have an impact on individuals that are named. But I think you're getting into conspiracy theories.
Yeah. And the last question is that, is the ceasefire done and dusted?
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is. I mean, I'm not saying we're going to see a ceasefire tonight. But first of all, ultimately, there's going to have to be a ceasefire one way or the other. But, I think there are still efforts to get it going. Whether they're going to succeed remains to be seen. And again, that's going to depend far more on whether or not there's willingness to pressure Israel than there is a willingness to pressure Hamas. Hamas needs that ceasefire now.
Yes. So with this, thank you so much for the privilege of your time, and
Thank you.
so much of humility for in explaining concepts to us. and so much of patience in explaining it with so much of detailing. And we are very privileged to have this empowering experience to have a conversation with you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, sir.